Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Rise to Your Peak podcast. I am here today with my guest, Dr. Kinney. Erin Kinney is the owner of the Kinney Clinic, and she is a naturopathic doctor who specializes in adrenal dysregulation. I'm very, very excited to have her on the podcast today because this is such a important topic deep in my heart. As many of the viewers know, we this is one of the items we specialize in, and we're getting a lot more patients in the past 6 to 12 months dealing with HPA axis dysregulation or adrenal dysregulation, which is snowballing into a slew of different symptoms, whether that be hormone issues, whether that be autoimmune issues, chronic fatigue, you name it. So I'm super excited to have this chat with Dr. Kinney today. Doctor, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to do this call. I'm sure the viewers are very excited to listen as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're tight on time, so let's just kind of dive right into it.
Sure.
Um, So as we were kind of chatting about previously, we are encountering a lot of patients at our clinic in the past year who come to us and they've already worked with a couple different clinics or providers and even functional medicine specialists. And they may have done a GI protocol or two. They feel like they've done the things to get better, yet they're still dysregulated. And
Hmm.
of course, you bring up the concept of stress to them, and it almost leads to a stress response because they feel like they've done everything humanly possible
Yeah.
um, to
Well,
address that already.
can I stop you there for a second? I think that response comes up a lot because I think if you're someone who's been to see a provider who kind of listens to you for a minute, but then is just like, oh, you must just be stressed. Like, here's an
Yeah.
antidepressant, here's the birth control pill, and they kind of write you off and kind of gaslight you and tell you that your symptoms aren't real and it's all in your head. So I think, because I have a lot of patients too, where they're like, oh my God, please don't tell me it's all in my head. I don't want this to be stress. But I think where the distinction has to come in is that you really need to understand that stress does make physical symptoms a lot worse. It's not all in your head, right?
Right.
So, I mean, sometimes the stress can be in your head, and we can talk about that later, but the impact that stress has on the physical body is very, very real. And
Yes.
it doesn't mean you need to be dismissed. Like there are things we can do about that, right? And
Totally.
sometimes, I mean, patients come in and they're like, I know I'm stressed. I know I need to work on that part.
Yeah.
Or like you said, they might be like, I already tried to work on my stress. What else can I do about that? But some people come in and their symptoms don't seem like they're stress related, right? They're like, this has got to be hormonal. My sex drive is low. I'm having vaginal dryness. I'm having hair loss. Like, how is this possibly related to my job or my divorce, right? They think
Right.
like this has got to be hormones.
Right.
And I think the education piece is so important, which is why I'm so glad we're on the show so we can have this conversation. It's really important to understand that when your body's been stuck in fight flight for so long, what happens, especially with this HPA axis that you keep mentioning, that axis is designed where it puts you into fight flight. And when that happens, all the cortisol floods the system to give you energy to go into fight flight mode so you can run or fight or deal with the
Survive.
stress,
Yeah.
right? And cortisol is a really, really important hormone. And I'm reading a book about it right now because I feel like it's so misunderstood. You have to have cortisol to function. If you don't have cortisol, you're not getting out of bed, you're not doing anything, you can't deal with stress. Nor can you deal with inflammation. Cortisol is one of the body's major anti-inflammatories. It's your body's natural steroid. It's your natural prednisone. And if you've been kind of in fight flight for a long time, you're going to be pumping out cortisol at really high levels. And so initially we tend to see cortisol levels go high. But what happens is when you're in a chronic stress state, the example I love to use when I'm teaching workshops is like, let's all remember back to March of 2020 when our fight flight response was getting triggered every 10 minutes. It was like, well, this is happening and now this is happening. And, there's a receptor in your hypothalamus that is supposed to either turn cortisol production on or off. And when we're in like a chronic stress mode, the body wisens up and it's like, I don't know that I should turn off production of, stress hormones. I should probably like downregulate this receptor so that I can keep in that fight flight mode. So we actually lose the ability to turn off.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes this happens with a patient. I've seen this with patients before where they're like, they went through a really stressful time and sometimes we feel okay while we're going through the divorce, while we're going through a move, while we were going through the first 3 months of the pandemic. Physically, our body's like, all right, we got this. We're going into fight flight mode. I'm like a supernova diva. I'm doing all the things. I'm not sleeping. I'm kind of burning the candle at both ends. And sometimes patients will know that they're headed towards that that's not good, that they're going to eventually crash. And
Right.
they remove the stressors. And then months later, they feel like shit. And they're like, wait a second, I don't understand. I've changed the stress on my life. How do I feel even worse?
Right.
And the reason that you feel worse, because this is a pretty common phenomenon, is that if your body downregulated those off button receptors in the brain, you're going to continue to act like you're in a fight flight mode,
Yeah.
even when the stressor is gone. And
Totally.
if you continue to stay in that fight flight mode for too long, what will eventually happen is your cortisol levels will decline. We
Yes.
start to see levels, and they can either decline in the morning and sometimes it'll be higher at night. We see dysregulation, but oftentimes what I see with my patients that are really, really struggling on a hormonal front or GI front or kind of all the fronts, their levels are in the tank.
Yeah.
I tested 4 point cortisol and they're all low, or their morning cortisol is really low. Maybe they get a little higher in the evening, but
Right.
low cortisol makes you feel like shit. Excuse my
Totally.
French. You have no energy. You will have no ability to deal with any sort of inflammation. And if we're talking about hormonal stuff, your body, if it doesn't have cortisol and it needs to wake up and just live life, it will start to steal from your sex hormones. For
Yes.
women, typically we start with progesterone, then we'll hit testosterone, and then we'll hit estrogen. For men, we go to testosterone. We don't have as much progesterone and estrogen for men. But so we start to see these declining levels. And if you
Yeah.
start taking HRT without addressing an underlying adrenal dysfunction, you might feel a little bit better, but you're not going to see the results that your friends or your colleagues are seeing that didn't have that. And I see this a lot. Patients like, oh my God, I got testosterone pellets. I'm taking estrogen, I'm taking progesterone, and I don't feel anything. I'm spending all this money, and they're pissed, right? But no one really took the time to address what was going
Yeah.
on with adrenal dysfunction.
Yes.
And so this, and I am kind of in this bucket I'm talking about now. I'm really
To
talking
to
about,
your point, real quick,
yeah,
progesterone converting into cortisol, we can see that progesterone HRT make matters worse.
yes,
Aching,
yes.
anxiety, insomnia, because all that progesterone HRT is converting into more cortisol. So to your point, you have
Yeah.
to address the problem.
Yes, you definitely have to address the problem. And I think it's probably, I mean, I don't know, I specialize in this, so I see this all the time, but I think if you're listening to this and you've been to see a bunch of different doctors, you've tried a bunch of protocols and they're not working like they should be working, this is often a piece that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
And like I said, you may have cleaned up the stress in your external life. And so there's two things that we like to talk about. If you're like, wow, like I'm doing all these stress reducing things. I've quit my job. I've gotten out of the bad relationship. I've moved out of a home that was stressful, whatever, and you're still feeling it. Could be that your body just doesn't know how to turn off. It doesn't know how to get back into
Needs to be
that.
reprogrammed.
It needs to be reprogrammed, and that, we can use herbal protocols, but there's a lot of different ways you can do that. A lot of different ways you can skin the cat for that. But the second thing that could be possibly happening is maybe your body is still stuck in fight flight, not because of what's happening externally, but because you have something internal that is stressing your system out. And so this is the thing that, and we were talking about this before we jumped on, that I test for all the time. And I like to call them internal stressors, or the word used was like an internal burden.
Absolutely.
But it's something, and so when I start working with the patient, I usually give them this analogy. I'm like, let's pretend that your body is like a house. And in that house, we have your kitchen, your laundry room, your bathroom, which are like your liver, your bowels, your kidneys, all of your major organs, right? So the body is always going to prioritize those functioning. That's going to be the number one function or the number one priority. A lot of patients that see me are also trying to lose weight. And I always tell them, I'm like, weight that you want to lose is like a basement closet that's filled with junk. It is not, unfortunately, it's not the top of the body's priority. So if if things aren't right internally in the gut and all these places, there's no way the body's cleaning out that closet. So, and you need two things to clean out the closet. You need energy and you need time, not in a stress state, right?
Love
So I like to set that stage. I'm like, okay, I want you to think about your body like this. An internal stressor is like someone trying to break into your house 24/7. And if that's the
it.
case, all your body's resources are going to go towards keeping that thing from fighting. And so that could be an infection like Lyme disease or Epstein-Barr or long haul COVID, could be mycotoxin exposure or mold exposure, could be environmental toxins. But again, it's something that the body is going to put at the top of the priority list because it doesn't want an invader coming into its house,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. And I love how you just laid that out. And similarly, how I'd like to explain to people to help them better understand the why behind what their body is doing is breaking it down in terms of the human body wasn't made for 2025. It was made for caveman times. And these are all adaptations for survival. Women shouldn't be having babies in a high threat scenario. So the body's going to know that and prioritize survival over fertility, cortisol over sex hormones, as you brought up. These are high survival adaptations, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, anxiety. If you were being hunted by a tiger,
You
all
want
these
all
things
those
would be
things. Yeah.
happening. You want
Yeah.
those things.
Yes.
We are looking at all these symptoms in America as disease and dysfunction, but most of them are adaptations for survival because of our bad lifestyle, our bad diet, and the burdens put on us by society, by social media, and by everything we put in our body every day and our environment, to your point. So it's a slew of things, and what I always try to help people understand is that stress is more than just what we perceive, and that's kind of where we're going with this, is the term stress is so singularized in society as like one thing or two things, but our body is keeping score. It's more like a bucket that starts overflowing over time, and then we
Yeah.
dysfunction.
But I also like to make when I'm talking to my patients about stress, because we spend a lot of time talking about it when I'm working with people one-on-one, is that to the body, stress is, I don't like to color it as good or bad because here's the deal. Exercise, guess what? Exercise is stress, but
Bingo.
exercise is good. It has tons of
Right.
great things. Do you have kids?
I do not.
So I have 5 kids. I love my kids, but are they stressful? Fuck yes, they're extremely stressful, right? So like sometimes stress is not, it doesn't have to be a bad thing.
Right.
And our bodies were designed to be under stress, right? We do really well under stress. It's
Right.
just the chronic stress that's the problem. Right. So and back to that receptor that I was talking about, it's really great for you to go and work out really hard. And your body should go into stress mode and you should get the high blood pressure, you should get the increased blood sugar, you should get all the things when you're in that because we want that in order to, exercise and
Yeah.
feel good. But
Yeah.
then after we're done with exercise or running from the tiger or making our child that's screaming happy, we
Needs to go
should
down.
be able to come out of that stress mode. And this is
Yeah.
where most people are failing is they
Yes.
don't go into stress mode and they literally lack the receptor that the body needs in order to come back out. And so all of the research that's done on meditation and breath work and any of the relaxing practices that we think of as reducing stress, the thing that they actually do in the body is they upregulate the production of that glucocorticoid receptor in the hypothalamus. So when you do those things, you are actually teaching the body and enabling the body to be able to come out of fight flight mode and back into that rest and digest or parasympathetic. So I'm not getting ahead of myself, but the problem with if you have one of these internal stressors that you are not aware of, and that is just going all the time, it is literally impossible for you to do those things. So my patients that are like, oh my God, I meditate, I get massages, I do all the things, and I still feel it. I'm stuck in this like trauma stress state. I'm like, okay, we want to look for Lyme, we want to look for mold exposure, we want to look for chronic viral stuff, we want to look for toxic overload because probably that's what's keeping your body stuck.
Bingo. You can retrain your nervous system, but only once the burdens are gone.
Yes.
It has to be in a safe place to calm down. If you're still
Yeah.
being hunted by the tiger, it doesn't matter how much somatic breathing you're doing.
Yes.
You need to remove the stressors. And to that point, it's not always in your control.
Mhm.
We need to pinpoint the stressor. That's step one. Pinpoint, uncover
Yes.
all those stones, then create
100%.
a plan to
Yeah.
reverse everything. And those plans, honestly, are typically pretty extensive because it's not just one thing. There could
Yeah.
be dietary components, there could be detoxification and inflammation components, there could be immune system regulation, there could be addressing the invaders, as you mentioned. And then there's the retraining of the nervous system and maybe using adaptogens and things of that nature to move the needle. But it's never just one thing that typically fixes all of this.
Yeah, it's never one. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a, and most people that end up, in a in a state like we're discussing, like you said, it isn't one thing. Maybe there is an internal burden of some kind. Maybe there's trauma from childhood. Maybe there's some emotional stress. Maybe they also had XYZ happen over the last 4 years. So I think it's important to understand if you're listening to this, it might take a while to unwind all of this.
Bingo.
But as you mentioned, the first step is identifying all of the things that are keeping your nervous system in that fight flight state, right?
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about what your process is when a new patient comes to you and you're kind of looking through their medical history and you're seeing, I'm sure there's red flags that you see that's like you're already anticipating what may be going on internally. What is kind of your first process of discussing with them, your thinking process, what testing you want to do and stuff like that? How do you
Yeah.
get them on board?
Yeah, I mean, well, we start with like a really detailed history, and in that, obviously, we'll talk about symptoms that they're having. But what I really want to know is, okay, how is your sleep? What's your sleep pattern? What are I mean, I really like to get a sense for what someone's lifestyle looks like. Like, what time are they going to bed? What are they doing before bed? Are they working before bed? Are they watching TV before bed? Are they watching scary murder dramas before bed?
Right.
Waking up at night? What time are they waking up? How do they feel in the morning? And then I want to know what their energy looks like. You can typically figure out what your cortisol levels are looking like if you map your energy throughout the day without caffeine or stimulants. So, I like to get us, and I ask patients like, hey, well, how do you feel if you don't drink coffee? What does that look like? Are you getting a crash? So I get a sense for that. I want to know what they're eating, how often they're eating. Are they skipping meals? I want to get a sense for what their blood sugar is doing because blood sugar is going to have a direct impact on cortisol and stress and all these things. I also want to know what their exercise routine looks like. I will tell you that probably the majority of the patients that I work with are over exercising
Totally
for their
agree.
body's needs. And this, and sometimes this is a tricky one, and I've been there too as a former marathon runner who burnt myself out multiple times, doing cardio till I was like till I literally was like blue in the face and had no energy. Sometimes when you're in that mode, it's hard to unwind that. So we just start to have the conversation, right? About like, hey, we might be overdoing it. And sometimes we wait till after labs to talk about that. So I want to understand like what they're doing cardio. And then we talk about stress. Hey, like what's going on in your life? What's your relationship like? What's your job like? What was the pandemic like? What was childhood like for you? Because I want to get a sense, is there major trauma? Is there current trauma? Um, and sometimes I think talking about those things, like if someone's open to talk, it just starts to open the door for them understanding, oh yeah, maybe the fact that, I had a horribly stressful childhood, maybe that's why I can't ever get out of stress mode because I was literally like my body grew up learning that that's how it needed to be in order to protect
Yes.
itself. So,
Yeah.
childhood trauma and or even recent trauma has a major impact on all of this stuff that we're working with as
Absolutely.
well. Um,
Absolutely.
and then we talk about infectious exposures. I ask about tick bites. I ask about a history of mono, history of COVID, history of any other. Do they get sick often? Do they have kids? Do they work in a school? Like, what's their exposure like? Do they travel a lot? Is it possible that they could have parasites? So, getting a really good history is a really good place to start. And that's going to ding a bunch of things for me to test for. But we always test. Obviously, we do all the hormones and all the nutrient levels, but we look at Lyme. We run a full Western blot. I test for Epstein-Barr, sometimes cytomegalovirus and HHV6. I find those are the three big viral infections that can kind of be like stealth infections. We will look at mold exposure. I will start that with blood work. I look at a lot of different inflammatory markers, complement markers. We look at like trans growth factor beta 1, MMP9, melanocyte stimulating hormone, and those will all give us like just some information like, hey, what's your immune system? Is it freaking out about anything? And
Yeah.
you can't get those tests I just mentioned. They're very what we call non-specific
Yes.
markers. So,
Yeah.
and but they give us some information. So if someone comes back with, really, really elevated complement C4 and a low CD57 and, maybe a couple Lyme bands, we're definitely going to do some more in-depth Lyme testing and we're going to send them for a mycotoxin panel. Lyme and mold, they often go together. Like, I don't
Yeah.
know that I've had a case of chronic Lyme that didn't have mold exposure. So,
No.
if you've been diagnosed with Lyme and you're not getting better, it's probably a good idea to look into mold and to mycotoxins.
Yeah.
And then Epstein-Barr, I mean, I rarely see a case of someone with adrenal fatigue that doesn't have a reactivated Epstein-Barr case. Now, that could also be with some other things. But the really interesting thing is I have a colleague here that I work with who specializes in mycotoxin exposure, and sometimes I send patients to him because he's got some really cool protocols. But we talk a lot about how, from the emotional standpoint, if your emotional boundaries are not where they need to be, right? So if your body energetically doesn't have good boundaries, you're much more likely to contract Lyme, to like have problems with mycotoxin exposure, to
Yeah,
get Epstein-Barr reactivation. So it's interesting. I pretty much like require my patients with chronic stuff. I'm like, you need to be doing some emotional work, some
yeah,
kind. You need to be in therapy. You need to be doing new
yeah.
emotional. It needs to be something where we're addressing this, working on boundaries, because if the energetic state of your body is not in a strong, good place, you are going to be a nicer host for things. It's going to change your pH. And when pH changes, the body doesn't work right, right?
Absolutely. It creates an environment for things to grow and thrive and opportunistic infections to come about. No, I explain the same thing to people all the time. You know, your detoxification pathways are compromised, your immune system is compromised. That hinders your body's ability to handle these burdens and remediate them on its own. And I just want to highlight real quick this entire conversation of your practice and your process highlights the difference with Western medicine. They
Yes.
see so many people per day. They're so limited on time. They're never doing deep dives. They're not capable of doing deep dives in this
Yeah.
fashion of that breadcrumb trail of
Yeah.
20 to 30 years of dysfunction. And they're
And I
so
think
fixated
they're
on one silo of symptoms.
Yeah, they're not capable of it just because they don't have the time, right? I mean, you
Exactly.
can't do any of this stuff in 15 minutes. Like you need at least an hour, right? To, when you have a 13-page lab report, like you're not going to go through that in 10 minutes.
Oh,
It's gonna take a while, right?
yeah.
And also when you've got a patient with 15 chief complaints and a history of trauma and a history of XYZ and all these things, it's gonna take a while to dig through and like get
Yes.
a really good history. So I don't think it's I mean, I'd love to like blame Western medicine. I don't really think it's the provider's fault. I think it's
No,
the
it's the
system's
system.
fault, right? It's the insurance companies paying them crap, and they have to see so many patients in order to make the business model work. And anyways, it's really sad that the system's that broken.
It
But
is.
it's amazing that there are so many more functional providers, up and coming now, which is really awesome. When
Absolutely.
I first was in practice, people were like, "What do you do? What kind of medicine?" Now I feel like it's much more talked about, which is fantastic.
Totally. And yeah, my point with that is, a lot of people feel so demotivated and like they're never going to get heard, they're never going to get things addressed, but they should feel a certain level of relief if someone is trying to dig into their past. The
Yes.
more questions they're asking, the more lab work or diagnostic testing they're wanting to do, they're looking to dig deep and assist you. And so if you're as a viewer or listener to this, if you're looking to potentially work with a functional provider, expect those steps, expect a vigorous consultation about your past and try to have an open mind to those line of questions because it could have been something from a long time ago. A lot of people are dealing with decades of dysfunction. And because we've all kind of normalized dysfunction, a lot of your symptoms you may not even be recognizing as symptoms, but they're all correlated to the same root cause.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I have a podcast as well called The Dr. Kinney Show, and my main message on the show, almost every episode we talk about it, is, you make sure if you're dealing with any sort of chronic health thing, make sure you're working with a provider that one, you trust, right? If you don't trust your provider, whether that's your primary care or a functional provider, because sometimes it's not a great fit and you don't trust them, you need a new provider. If
Yeah.
you walk into a doctor's office and you already have a sense of mistrust, guess what? Your nervous system is not going to relax, you're not going to heal. So it's really, really important that you're working with someone that you trust, that you feel comfortable talking about and answering all the questions that because we're going to ask you a lot of questions. We're going to talk about your poop. We're going to talk about your vaginal secretions. We're going to talk about your sex drive. We're going to ask you about your childhood trauma. And if you don't feel comfortable talking about that, I mean, maybe there's some things you're not quite ready to talk about, but you do want to work with someone that you feel comfortable with and your nervous system can relax with. I did a consult I don't know, a few years ago. I do these free consults just to make sure, I'm a good fit, they're a good fit. And I talk very fast, and that's just who I am. And the patient was like, "Do you think you could slow down? I don't." And I was like, "Yeah, no, I'm not going to slow down. This is who I am." And, and
Yeah.
so I referred her to somebody else. But, the point of me sharing that is that do the work to find someone that you trust. I mean, and find someone that feels good and is going to go the extra mile for you. Because I think that's really what you need here is you need someone that's going to work with you until you figure out what's going on.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that there's not a truer statement than, going that extra mile. That is what a functional specialist is going to do with someone is go that extra mile because that is what's needed.
Yes.
To that point, I 100% agree with you about the potential for trauma, PTSD, a mental health component to be somewhat of a hindrance in there. And it's funny because some of my colleagues in the GI health world have kind of leaned into that mental health component being the biggest factor for what led to people stubborn cases healing. And I'm kind of going down this foreign invader, unknown burden being that hindering factor. And they're both right, you know?
Yeah.
Um, do you tend to have specific colleagues that specialize in the mental health component that you team up with in certain cases? How do you tend to handle that?
I mean, I think if, like I said, if someone clearly has a history of, some sort of like mental health diagnosis or there has been big trauma, like I say, if they're not already getting supported by a provider just for that, we make sure they are. And the other thing that's really important here, guys, is sometimes it's good to have a team of people working on your case, right? Right? You have someone that's kind of being the quarterback and doing all the things. You might need a specialist here and there to look at different things. And I think, you were talking about some people are like, this is the answer for everything, and this is the answer. I'm of the approach where like it's not no one thing's going to be the answer for everybody, right? I think it's really important that you figure out what's going to be the answer for you. Some people,
Yeah.
yes, it's going to be Lyme disease has fucked their body. Sorry, I'm cursing lots of nights.
Yeah,
I've been home with my kids a lot this
yeah.
week. It's gotten their body to a state, and that's what they need to address. Other people, it is like the PTSD or the trauma from childhood that's, created a mental health state or whatever, and that might be the thing that they need to focus on the most. But to answer your question, yes, I love to work with other providers on cases to make sure that patients are getting all the right support. Because, as when we're dealing with complex issues, sometimes one person can't do it all. One provider can't do it all, right? I mean, I have a, bunch of tools in my toolkit, but I don't have all the tools, right? And so if a patient comes to me and I'm like, okay, great, these are my protocols. I'm not sure this is quite right for you. I'm going to refer them out to somebody else who might have a tool in their toolbox that's going to be a better fit for them. And
Yeah.
I think with that mindset, and that's typically what you'll find, I think, in the functional alternative space is that we love, I don't know, I love working with other providers and I want to make sure that patients are getting the care the right care for them,
Yeah.
right? So I think
Absolutely.
having a collaboration, having a collaborative approach is really, really helpful for people.
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think there's a certain level with it within our community. I think because we have such a passion to actually help this person, even a level of humility of this might not be my specialty, but I have the person for you, and to be able to remove that potential client and hand it off to someone else and be totally okay with that because they're in great hands elsewhere. I think that it just shines another level of passionate care for that person's well-being.
Yeah. Yeah, because sometimes, I mean, I diagnose a lot of Lyme, I diagnose a lot of mycotoxin illness. And like I said, there are some great mold detox things you can do internally, but there are a lot of really cool tools out there that I don't have. So oftentimes I'm referring out for those things. But yeah, I think, going back to the, kind of the original intent of this episode, looking for those internal stressors can be life-changing for some people, right? They've like gone to see all the different doctors and they think it's a hormone problem, it's a hormone problem, it's a hormone problem. But oftentimes the reason your hormones are having problems is because you've got something living, you're trying to break into that house and your body's not able to make sex hormones because it's just stuck in that fight flight state.
Oh,
So, doing the testing is really, really helpful.
100%. You had mentioned that most of the cases you've encountered anecdotally with chronic adrenal fatigue or HPA axis dysregulation, you've noticed an EBV
Mhm.
correlation there.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I was kind of going to say a similar statement regarding mold.
Oh,
Um, tell me a little bit about your experiences with Epstein-Barr and that kind of being that silent uh,
sure.
silent burden in
I
people's.
mean, Epstein-Barr is a virus that probably 90% of the adult population has contracted at some point in their life, right? It's in the herpes family of virus. It's cousins to chickenpox and herpes 1 and herpes 2. And so it's a virus that once you get, it's never going to completely go away. It will go into a dormant stage. And for most people, they get it. Sometimes you get mono, sometimes you get a cold. Some people don't even have symptoms. Body deals with it, puts into a dormant phase. You might be fine. If that virus reactivates, it wreaks havoc internally on the system. And the tricky thing about EBV is it's not like shingles, for example. You get chickenpox as a kid. Some people get shingles as an adult. It's very easy to diagnose. It's like, oh, you got a shingles rash. I mean, shingles sucks, but it's easy to diagnose. You know what it is. You treat it, and you're fine. EBV is not easy to diagnose symptomatically. Like, I've had patients, everything from hair loss to joint pain to brain fog to fatigue to weird rashes, acne. It basically, it's robbing your body of all of its resources so the body can't fix things, right? And so I see, if someone has a reactivated EBV case, that's usually the first place we'll start, as long as they don't have Lyme or mold or something else. But if that's just it, we will put them on heavy, antiviral protocols, immune boosting protocols, and we treat that for, 10 to 12 weeks, sometimes longer, depending on the case. And then it's so much easier for me to make changes with their hormones, for me to get their adrenals back into better shape. And, so many people just feel so much better. They're like, wow, this is amazing. And the tricky thing about EBV is, I have patients that come in that have been tested for it. They're like, oh yeah, my doctor told me it was a past infection. There is an antibody you can check that shows whether it's in a reactivated state or not.
That
But
was
we
my next question for you.
yeah. So there's four tests that I run. There's one that's called the EBV IgM antibody, which that's looking at your initial response to Epstein-Barr. So that's usually made when you have a first encounter and when you are acutely contagious with that virus. That eventually goes away, and then you get this IgG viral capsid antibody, which is looking at the body's ability to attack the outside of the virus. And then you'll also develop an IgG nuclear antibody, which is the body's ability to attack the nucleus of that virus. And those will, you get the virus, IgM goes up, IgM goes down, the other two IgGs go up. They will be positive forever. You'll always have some level of those.
Wow.
Once the virus goes into a dormant phase, typically we'll see those levels go down a bit, but they'll still be positive. If the virus reactivates, we see two things. One, there's another antibody that's called the early antigen antibody, and that one rises when that virus comes out of its dormant phase. So if we see that elevated, that's 100% you've got a reactivated Epstein-Barr case. Sometimes patients don't fully get that, but they will see a huge surge in their nuclear antibody and their viral capsid antibody. They'll be up like over 600. And the other thing that I like to look at when we're treating, as we're like treating along the course, is there's a very specific type of white blood cell called CD57 cells. And they are like, I like to think of them as your sniper cells. They go out and they shoot and they kill stealth infections. They kill Lyme and they also kill Epstein-Barr. If those guys are really, really low, that's usually an indication that the immune system is struggling. It's spent all of its men and it doesn't have any more men. And that usually is a sign like that virus is winning. Now, that can also be, if they're really low and they don't have EBV, I'm thinking more Lyme mold because mold will suppress those too, right? So if your CD57 cells are low, it's usually a good sign that something infectious or some sort of stealth thing is happening in your body. But that's what, when I'm treating, as we repeat labs, that's what I'm looking for to see the increase in, because oftentimes your EBV antibodies, it might take years for them to go down because the body keeps the antibodies around just in case it reactivates again. They will eventually go down. Again, you'll always have that nuclear antigen and the viral capsid one positive, but they'll just be a lot lower. But it's those CD57 cells that I use to track progress. And when patients, those cells are in a good place, people feel so good because it's like their immune system has the men it needs in that house analogy, it's like you've got guards out front that are taking care of that. So you can take care of the kitchen and clean out the closet and do all the things you need to do in your house, right?
I love that. And to be clear for people, these markers are not going to be on your standard CBC panel or standard blood work that your GP would provide. So very often things can look normal, but it means you need to do deeper digging.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you have a reactivated, if you get acute mono, you will see
Yeah.
dysregulation in your white blood cells and sometimes red blood cells. But when you get a reactivation of Epstein-Barr, your CBC is going to look normal. Your regular white blood cells will look normal. Like you're not going to, and your doctor's like, oh, you're fine. And I've had patients that have asked their doctors to check their EBV numbers, and the doctor's like, oh, it's just an old infection, you're fine. But even though their antibody levels are over 600, and the patient's like, is that normal? Like the over 600 is not normal. That usually is indicative of, that virus is out of its, dormant phase and it's wreaking some havoc in your system.
That is very, very useful information. So thank you so much for that. It's got me intrigued to dig even deeper into EBV
Yeah.
now.
And there's a lot of information out there. I get patients that come. I don't know if you've heard of the medical medium, Anthony Williams. He's like the big EBV guy. His books are pretty interesting. I don't follow all of the stuff, he puts out there, but he talks a lot about EBV being like the silent, thing that's causing a lot of problems in people's health. And,
Absolutely.
again, if you think of that analogy, if someone's breaking into your house all the time, you're going to be in a stress state constantly, and your house is going to have problems because you're not going to be cleaning your kitchen. You're not going to be doing all the things because you're just worried about the thing breaking in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's so interesting. And again, just to kind of, further drive this home, there could be a slew of different things because chances are if you do have something like EBV or mycotoxin exposure or Lyme disease, you're also going to end up with gut microbiome dysregulation. So you're
Yes.
very likely to end up with H. pylori, Candida, SIBO, things
Oh,
of that nature. And now you have multiple different infections impacting your immune system at once. And it's not just addressing one, it's kind of addressing all of the above because they're all technically stressors
yes.
impacting the body.
Yeah,
Um,
SIBO is a big one. We see a lot of SIBO in our clinic, and I find patients will come in and they've been treated for SIBO multiple times, and it's because nobody has addressed the underlying reason why the SIBO keeps coming back. And
exactly.
probably 9 out of 10 times, it's Lyme, mold, or EBV are the underlying things. And once we effectively treat those things, the SIBO goes away and doesn't come back.
Incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is all about figuring out like what is the root of things for your case. And
Right.
again, finding a provider that's going to help you do that. A provider that you trust that is going to help you do that.
Right. And keep in mind that you didn't get into dysfunction overnight, so you're not going to get out of it dysfunction
Yeah.
overnight. None
Yes.
of these situations are a couple days, a couple weeks. I would say at a minimum a couple months in my experience. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would say I tell people I'm like 3 months is the minimum that you need to be
Yes.
on protocol. And for some people, if their diet's healthy, if they're taking really good care of their body, they're drinking water, they're getting good sleep, they've got all those foundational habits, and we're clearing out one or two things. 3 months is a very doable time frame for kind of adjusting these things. If we have to also do some work on the lifestyle stuff, if we're not sleeping well, if diet is not so great, or you're in a crap relationship or in a stressful job, it's going to take a little longer for the body to heal just because you're going to have added stress to the situation.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, I
But you can heal, right? I think that's the big,
absolutely. That's the focal point is don't give up hope. If
Mhm.
you're still dysregulated, it just you haven't gone deep enough yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I know we're running low on time, and I know how precious your time is. You got to get to saving people's lives and reversing dysfunction. So, I really, really appreciate your time today. This has been awesome information. Like I said, I'm already intrigued to
Oh,
dig
great.
deeper myself. So, I'm looking forward to you and I chatting more about situations. Um, Dr. Kinney, just for the sake of our viewers, if they want to follow you and listen to your podcast or connect with you, maybe ask some questions, what are the best ways that they can contact you, whether that be social media, email, etc.?
Sure. So you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Kinney. That's where I tend to hang out the most. Or you can follow our clinic at the Kinney Clinic. And my podcast is called The Dr. Kinney Show. You can listen to it on all the platforms. We work with people virtually. So if you're interested in chatting with myself or one of our providers, you can schedule a free consult. That's probably the best way to get in touch with us. And then I have a book coming out in 2026 all about cortisol. It's called The Cortisol Cure. So if you want to
Wow,
get
that's so
updates on
exciting.
that, stay tuned. And I'll be talking about it more on social media. But yeah, I'm
That's
excited.
super exciting.
Yeah,
Congratulations on
thank
that.
you.
Do you guys service all most of the nation?
We do, yes.
Awesome. So anyone in the United States can reach out for assistance.
Yes, they can.
That is awesome. Well,
Yeah.
again, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Kinney. I really appreciate it. This was an awesome podcast. I honestly think we could do a whole nother episode into other
Sure.
deep dives. So I look forward to chatting with you more. I hope you have a great day and we'll be touching base soon.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye, guys.